Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Lunch and Learn series for the Executive Management series. Thank you and welcome. We're up to Unit 5 and we're going to be looking at negotiation and conflict today, which of course is something that we've all got to deal with at senior levels. So I look forward to working with you in the next hour and as usual you'll receive a copy of the slides and the recording at the end of this presentation. So just relax and enjoy the process. All right, and of course if you've got questions or you've got comments or observations, you can type them into the question box over on the right hand side and I'll see them immediately, and at that stage of course I'll answer them the moment I see them. I'm the only one that sees those comments and questions, but nevertheless I'll respond to them immediately. All right, so let's look at where we've been so far in the process. Now, what you're seeing on your screen there, of course, is the 6 units that we cover in the series. And just quick recap, we talked about enhancing individual influence, and I got you to complete the diagnostic on that. And so that gives you a profile around influence, and the key point about that is to start working on the areas where you had a lower score, and I hope you've had a chance to do that. Of course, units 1 and 2 were swapped around, but in unit 2, which was strategically managing performance, we looked at some of the important issues around strategic management of performance, and I hope you've had a chance now to start considering that in relation to your own workplaces. In Unit 3, we covered a very important but often neglected topic around creating thinking space. I think as senior people, we're all busy. We've all got lots of things on. We tend to go from back-to-back meetings. We tend to go from one activity to the next. And sometimes we need to take a breath. We need to create thinking time. We need to start thinking about how we might approach the new activity or whatever. So I hope you've been able to do this in your schedule, because it's very important to do that, to create that space to be more effective in what you're doing. In Unit 4, which was the last unit we did, we looked at options for organisational structuring. And what I did is I shared with you the 3 conventional approaches to organisational structuring. And then I talked about the pros and cons of each. And I shared with you my new approach, which was what we call a customer-centric model. So I hope you've had a chance to consider that with your team or organisation as to how you might structure things better in order to get a more effective result. There is no perfect answer in relation to structures. There is not one structure, one size fits all, but it's important to understand the pros and cons of each. So today we're going to look at negotiation and conflict management, as I mentioned, and then the last unit we'll look at in 2 weeks' time will be driving positive cultural change in your organisations. All right, so let's get underway. Your homework was to spend some time looking at some of the changes to your structures and to discuss these with your team and to consider some of those structures and how they might operate in your own organisation. It may not be possible at the moment for you to make those changes, but the important thing is that you consider them, and if and when the opportunity arises, is to start to look at those sorts of structures and be critically reflective about how performance is managed in those organisations. So I hope you've had a chance to do that. Always keen to hear your feedback, so I'm always available on email. You can always send me an email and explain what you've been doing, some of the trials and tribulations and so forth. All right, so what are we going to be doing today? Well, we're going to look at a model of political awareness, and you might say, well, why would I be covering political awareness when we're talking about negotiation and conflict management? Well, the reality is that we are not working in a vacuum. We work in a system. The system extends beyond the boundaries of the organisation. And so it's very important for senior people to be very politically savvy. And I often find people are quite put off by that idea. But the reality is, in order to be effective, you need to be politically aware. I'm then going to share with you a conflict resolution model, which came from Thomas Kilmann's model, which they're probably the most reputable scholars in this area. And I'm going to share with you that model, and hopefully you've had a chance to complete your conflict resolution um, diagnostic, which was the second one that you had to do in this series, and that gives you some clue as to where your strengths and opportunities for growth are around managing conflict. There is no one right way, and the key for this session is really to be flexible, to try different things in different situations with different people. And then, of course, I'll talk about when you could use each of those 5 strategies, what sort of circumstances would work best for you when you might consider those. And then I'm going to end up talking about some case studies. So I'm going to share with you some scenarios and ask you which of those 5 do you think might be appropriate given the limited information, and what would you do in that circumstance. So we'll have some fun with that towards the end of the hour that we work together. All right, so let's look at this model of political skills for leaders. And it's a great model. It's Badley's work, and it's a great model just to frame how we might look at political awareness, or as he calls it, political skills. Now, the first axis there on your screen is on one end of the continuum, we have game players. And by game players, I'm talking about people who basically are always trying to take advantage of different circumstances and situations. All organisations have game players. Hopefully you're not one of them, but it's very obvious and people are very aware of that because the pattern of behaviour is quite predictable. At the other end of the continuum, we have people who act with integrity. Now, people who act with integrity, hopefully that's you. We would want you to be acting with integrity. And the assumption is if we're politically savvy, we may not be showing a great deal of integrity. Well, that's not actually the case. So let's just remind ourselves that you can be politically aware and act with integrity. All right. Now, the other axis, of course, is political awareness. So people who are very astute and very politically aware. And let me give you a definition of political awareness, because again, I think that's an area that people often forget or don't realise or assume other things. Political awareness, in my view, is just simply being aware and conscious and empathetic that when you do something or don't do something, it's going to have an impact on the system as a whole, and particularly at a senior level. So, for example, if you call a meeting or send an email, people will perceive this in different ways. And being aware of the perceptions that other people might have and being accurately aware of what those perceptions are can help you craft the message that you're trying to get across so that it's not misunderstood. So all political awareness really is an empathy of how other people in the organisation might perceive your actions or inactions. And of course, at the other end of the continuum there, we have politically unaware. And these are people who often do say to you when they come to work, and they say, well, I'm not interested in playing politics. I just come to work, I do my job, and then I go home. And of course, that's a little naive, because we're all in that political vacuum. We're all working in that area and that space. So we need to be politically aware, particularly if you're an executive, because of course you've got a greater span of influence and more opportunity to be able to construct or deconstruct certain messages. So that's how the model's set up. And then what we have in the 4 quadrants, 2x2 matrix, a typical model, we have people who are clever. People who are clever are people who are game players, who are politically aware. So they're all very astute about the impact of their political impact. But of course, they're always doing things for themselves rather than other people. and that's why we refer to them as a fox. And the trouble with foxes, of course, is that foxes have to be even more and more cunning than they already are in order to get what they want, because the bottom line is that everybody knows that they're a fox, so they know they're out to get certain gains. Now, people who are game players, who are politically unaware, are people that we would call inept, and we'd use a donkey to describe them. So these people are always trying to get advantage for themselves, and we know that, but they're not very clever at it. So they are really donkeys. So they very rarely get what they want, and people often don't have a huge amount of respect for them. So we don't want you to be on the left-hand side of this, model. It's not a good place to be. Where we want you is on the right-hand side, and in particular, but not necessarily in the innocent frame. The innocent frame is where you act with integrity, but you're politically unaware. So you're doing what you believe to be right, but you're not really conscious of how your actions are impacting on other people. So the animal that best describes that perhaps is a lamb. So lambs to the slaughter, as they say. We don't want you to be there either, because these people who are politically unaware but act with integrity often aren't quite as effective as they'd like to be, because they're unaware of the impact that they have on the organisation. Not only are they unaware, they're not terribly interested in it either. Where we need you to be is wise. We need you to be politically aware and act with integrity. So being politically aware and acting with integrity would be the owl. So these people, of course, are doing the right thing in terms of trust and integrity, but ultimately they're also very savvy of understanding how their impact is with the organisation. That's where we need you to be. So I wanted to share that with you up front, because I think it's very important for you to try and be as much as possibly aligned with the politically aware and act with integrity wise owl, because by doing that you're going to be more effective. So the point about this is that you can be politically aware and still act with integrity. Although I should say that the higher up you are in an organisation, the more complex decisions are, and the more difficult it is, because there are more grey areas. So things aren't necessarily black and white. So it's not quite as simple as the model might point out, but certainly the intent should be around acting with integrity and being politically aware. All right, so now what I'm sharing with you now is the model, and what I want to do here is talk about the model, and if you've completed the conflict negotiations diagnostic, you would have some scores around these 5 areas in the green model. So let me share with you how the model works, and while I'm doing that, it might be a good idea to have a look at your diagnostic, and it would be interesting for you to determine where you fit on the model, because the reality is all of us have a preferred way of dealing with conflict, and the problem with that is that we may overuse it. And if we overuse it, it means that we're being less flexible than we probably could be. So let's start up in the top. Well, first of all, have a look on the left-hand side. You've got the degree of assertion. So obviously lower down, the less assertive, and the higher up, the more assertive. And across the bottom, we have cooperativeness. That is working with and through other people in order to get what you want, and to do that in a cooperative fashion. So on the left-hand side, we have less cooperative behaviour, and on the right-hand side, we have more cooperative behaviour. So these are the 2 variables in any negotiation or any conflict. And of course, negotiation is just another form of conflict. It's because, of course, you wouldn't need to negotiate with somebody unless, of course, there was some differences of viewpoint, which arguably is a form of conflict. So over on the top left-hand corner, as you look at your model on your screen, you'll see competing. So competing is a win-lose paradigm. That is where you win at the expense of the other person. And so there is a time and a place for that, and I will talk about that in more detail shortly. But have a look at your score on competing. Now you might say, what's a high score and what's a low score? Well, the diagnostic was out of 12, so any score, a 10, 11 or 12 is a high score, and if you got a 10, 11 or 12 for competing, it probably suggests that you are too favourably disposed to competing. So you're probably using it in circumstances where you should be using one of the other four. Of course, a low score would be the other end, which is a 0, a 1 or a 2. And what that would imply is that you're perhaps allowing people to take advantage of your goodwill at different times. So it's important to try to reconcile that. The other way to look at this is to look at your score comparative to the other four scores. So if your competing score is much lower than your other four scores, then it probably suggests that you could be doing more of that. And of course, if it's relatively high, as I said, it may be that you believe that it's the appropriate way when in fact there are other ways of dealing with conflict. So that's competing. Now, if we go to the other end, which is the opposite end, and we look at the accommodating is actually lose-win. That is, you lose and the other person wins. So in other words, you let the other person get their way. Now, why would you do that? Well, it's a perfectly useful idea when the old adage of let people win the battle so that you can win the war. If the issue is more important to them than it is to you, then it's quite possible that accommodation is the right way to go. And the reason why you might do that is because you want to maintain a good working relationship with the other person. So, for example, if it's a colleague at work that you need to work with very closely, accommodating occasionally is a very appropriate response. And any of us who are in relationships, long-term relationships, would understand that we have to accommodate in certain circumstances in order to maintain the harmony of our relationship. So we understand the relevance of that, but when you look at your score, have a look and determine how does it compare to the other four scores. So if you had a relatively low score in accommodation, it might mean that you're too keen on trying to get your own way, and sometimes it's appropriate perhaps to just let it go and let the other person win, particularly when the relationship may be at stake. Now, if your score is relatively high on accommodation, it probably means that you're a bit of a doormat and you're allowing people to walk all over you when they shouldn't. So you're allowing people to take advantage of you, and that's not a good place to be, because by allowing other people to take advantage of you and doing it too often, what you're doing is you're signaling to the other people that know you very well that if they push hard enough, they will probably get their own way. So it will precipitate quite aggressive responses from other people because they know your natural style is to perhaps let them win. So they just have to push a bit harder. And of course, then you get upset with people and think, why are people taking advantage of my goodwill? And the answer, of course, is in the mirror. The fact is that you're allowing people to do that. All right, so let's now go up. Let's go across here to avoiding. Now, you might think, well, that doesn't sound like a very good approach to dealing with conflict, to avoid it. But there is a time and a place where it's perfectly appropriate to avoid. Let me give you an example. Let's say, for example, that somebody says something in a meeting and you don't have enough information at your fingertips to be able to respond to that at the time. You might then say to the other person who's raised the issue with you to let them leave it with you, and then you'll go and do your homework and come back to them when you've got the right response. And that's perfectly valid. Now, that's not an excuse not to get back to them, of course, but it's allowing you time and space for you to marshal your resources to give them the answer that they want. So it is appropriate. Now, it also depends on your score. If you look at your model and you notice that your avoiding score is quite high compared with the other four, then it probably suggests that there is times when you do avoid conflict, when perhaps you actually should be involved and you should try and deal with it. Of course, the other end of the scale is if you've got a very low score in avoiding, it's probably likely that you're getting involved in every bun fight around the place, and you need to, uh, you need to just be very selective about the things that you deal with because you can't get involved in every bun fight around the place. So there is a time and a place for avoiding, even though it doesn't sound like a great word. It's perfectly a valid approach to dealing with certain forms of conflict. Now, if we go to the middle here, compromising, it's halfway up the assertiveness scale and it's halfway up the cooperative. Why? Because when you compromise, essentially what you're doing is you're giving something and in return, hopefully you're getting something. So, normally when we buy a house, the seller has a certain price that they want to pay and the buyer has a certain price that they're willing to pay. And normally the seller and the buyer will come to some sort of an agreement about a middle price. That's a compromise. Both parties aren't necessarily completely ecstatic about the result. So therefore, the cooperativeness is not necessarily at a high level, but certainly you've got to be assertive to a certain degree by sticking to your guns in terms of what you want, your bottom line, if you like. And of course, in most cultures, compromise is seen as an appropriate form of dealing with conflict. The trouble is, if you've got a relatively high score in compromising, it's probably likely that you're getting too involved. You're too interested in trying to give and take, and sometimes you should just hold the line, particularly in something where you're actually right or where the other person's taking advantage of you. But there's nothing worse if you've got a high score in compromising of dealing with someone that doesn't want to compromise with you. And when that sort of circumstance arises, it becomes extremely frustrating because, of course, the other party doesn't want to compromise and you're willing to do that. Then obviously you're not going to be able to compromise because the other party's not willing to do that. That will be enormously frustrating for you if you've got a relatively high score there. Now, here's a little thought. Have a look at your collaboration score and have a look at your compromising score. Now, if your compromising score is relatively high and your collaboration score is relatively low, then there's a really good learning opportunity for you there, and that is this. Collaboration, by definition, is where both parties win. It's a win-win, but what happens is that you need to enter into an extended dialogue in order to come up with a new approach to dealing with the conflict that you're both happy with. So in other words, it's about coming up with some sort of a creative or out-of-the-box solution. The problem with that, of course, is it takes time, and a lot of things in our workplace, we just don't have the time. And so sometimes it's not actually possible to collaborate. But where it is possible, it's great because obviously it's high on cooperativeness, as you can see, because both parties have to come to an understanding about the other person and what they're doing. And then on the other hand, they both, have to be reasonably assertive because you've obviously got to have a conversation or two or three in order to come to a resolution around that problem. So again, if you've got a high score in collaboration, it's likely that you'll be very upset with people that don't want to collaborate with you because you see that as a natural negotiation style. But on the other hand, if it's a low score, it probably means that at times you need to be flexible enough to look at other ways and means of solving the conflict. So you can see that it can be very useful if and when we've got the time to be able to actually collaborate and where both parties are willing to collaborate. So that's the model. And so with your scores, it gives you some sort of an indication of where you sit in terms of how you prefer to deal with conflict. And the ideal approach, of course, is to have relatively even scores across all five. So in other words, you're willing and able to be flexible enough to change your approach depending on the negotiation or the conflict that you're in. And in fact, if I was able to talk to your staff, if I could actually talk to some people that reported to you, and I could actually ask them the question, I said, here's the model. Can you tell me which of these five that person is particularly interested in? Now, the answer that I want, and you would want, I think, would be, I don't know. Sometimes they're compromising, sometimes they're competing, sometimes they'll avoid, sometimes they'll accommodate, sometimes they'll collaborate. It depends on what it is and who it is. Now, that's what you want, because people who are able to be flexible around this grid are actually got a greater array of possibilities of dealing with conflict. So therefore, they're more likely to be successful in terms of getting a resolution to a negotiation or a conflict. All right, so that's the model. Now, what I want to do now is drill down a little bit further and talk about each of these different styles and have a discussion about where you might use each of these particular approaches. So the first one that's on your screen there is competing. So let's have a look. So when competing is appropriate is where speed and decisiveness are necessary. So it might be an emergency. It could be a safety issue. It could be something that's quite, customer driven. We've got deadlines to meet and decisions just have to be made and we have to get on with it. So in those sorts of circumstances, it's perfectly appropriate for you to compete because you don't have the luxury of time to do anything else other than to make a decision. Now, it might create short-term pain in the sense that the other party may not be happy with the result, but also if you're not doing it all the time, they might be happy with you to do that because they understand that at the end the decision had to be made because of the decisiveness and the speed factors involved. So that would be one time. Now, if somebody, of course, is trying to take advantage of you, your goodwill or whatever, it might be appropriate for you to stand up to that person and just gently but firmly let them know that you're not budging on this issue and that this thing is very important to you and, that's that. So if you had a low score in competing, you might find that difficult to do. But nevertheless, it's important to do that because the other person needs to know where they stand with you in relation to what's important to you. So if you compete, you're letting the person know that these things are non-negotiable, that they are important, and you'll stick to your ground. Now, if you, as a senior manager, have to make unpopular decisions, and we all have to do that from time to time, it's probably best just to make the decision. There's no point in trying to sugarcoat it. At the end of the day, you might preface it by saying to people, look, this is unpopular. It won't be something that you will like, but it has to be done because of blah, blah, blah. So you give people a reason for it. And that's a perfectly appropriate response, often when you've got unpalatable decisions that have to be made in the workplace. Now, provided you're not making all your decisions that way and you're just making excuses, then people have a tendency to accept that on the proposition that they recognise it's unpopular, and hopefully if you've sold it well, they could also acknowledge that it has to be made. All right, so that there is a time and a place for that. So that's the competing approach. So if your scores are low, then you need to look for opportunities where you can do more competing. And of course, if your scores are high, you need to ask yourself a very important question. And the question is, am I too keen to create win-lose situations in my workplace and with my stakeholders? All right, moving right along. let's talk about the next one, which is accommodating. Now, remember, accommodating is where you lose and the other party wins. So why would you want to do that? Well, as I mentioned earlier on in the broadcast, if the relationship is more important than the issue, it might be prudent for you to let the other person have it their way. So, for example, if one of your team members needs time off to deal with a family issue, and yet this is the busiest time of the year, and you really can't afford to let them have the time off, you might just sit back and think to yourself, well, one, if I was in their position, I would probably feel the compulsion to deal with whatever it is I have to deal with. And two, it's highly likely that if I show them some goodwill and give them some slack, it may well pay off in the big picture, where certainly they will return that favour and perhaps put in some extra hours at another time or whatever it might be. So if the relationship has to be maintained, and by digging your heels in by competing it will destroy or at least harm the relationship, then it might be a good idea to rethink that and think about whether you should accommodate. So that would be one particular time and place that you would use it. Of course, another time where you'd use accommodation is where you can't possibly have your needs met. So really you're probably privileged to other information, and you're aware that frankly you've got your hands tied behind your back. There is nothing that you can do about the circumstance, and because of that you may as well just let them have it their way and gain the brownie points for allowing that to happen. So sometimes it's good just to let the other party win, because there is no choice. You have no option other than to do that. So that would be appropriate, of course, in those circumstances. And most importantly, if it's not very important to you, then why would you be digging your heels in? There are plenty of things that are important to us in the workplace, things that we don't need to deal with. So why are we getting involved in all sorts of things that we can't actually resolve? So just let it go. It's not worth it. It's just something that's not worth even entertaining. Let it go. And if you've got a low score in accommodation, you might find that you're getting involved in too many smaller issues, which quite frankly are taking up all your time and energy. You're better off just to let them go. Then again, if you've got a high score there, it might mean that you're doing that too often, in which case it's probably not a good idea, because people will take advantage of your goodwill. Okay, so that's accommodation. Now, the next one is avoiding. As I said before, there is a time and a place to avoid, and have a look at your score on your diagnostic. So, when would you use avoiding? Okay, let's have a look. Diplomacy. So, for example, you're in a meeting, somebody said something that's factually incorrect, but by you trying to correct them, it might take the meeting off on a tangent somewhere that's not productive, because they might get all defensive about it. And you think to yourself, look, there's a bigger picture here. We need to resolve this issue. And quite frankly, it was inaccurate, but I'm not going to say anything because it's not really impacting on the decision that we need. So I just close my mouth and say nothing. So that would be perfectly appropriate in certain circumstances when you're negotiating and somebody's told you something that's not entirely correct, but by you correcting them, it will not really help you resolve the issue in the bigger scheme of things. Another time, as I mentioned earlier, would be where you need to buy yourself time, put off the decision for a better time. Perhaps the other person is hot under the collar, they're upset, maybe you're upset, and maybe you're both upset. And really, it's no point in ploughing on because you're both emotionally charged, and it might just be better to take time out and come back to the circumstance at a later stage. Or, as I said, if you're put on the spot and you don't have the information at your fingertips, it's quite possible for you to say to the other party, leave it with me, I'll check it out and I'll get back to you, say by the close of business today. So that would be perfectly appropriate rather than to sort of fumble your way through and not come up with the right information or the right, the right result. Another case would be, look, if the relationship isn't important and frankly the issue isn't important, then I would suggest to you to just let it go. And I think lots of people get involved in things around the place that quite honestly don't meet the relationship or the issue test. There's plenty of things for us to get involved in the workplace. We don't need to get involved in everything, and quite frankly, it's impossible to do so anyway. So let it go. There's no point in you getting involved. So there is a time and a place. Having said that, if you've got a relatively high score in avoiding, what it probably suggests is that you're doing that when in fact you should be involved. And if you've got a relatively low score, then perhaps you are getting involved in too many things that require effort that really, frankly, is not applicable. So that's where you might avoid. And the other thing is you just need to find out more information. So a client or a customer has spoken to you, it's news to you, you weren't aware of a situation, and before you respond to that customer or client, you actually say to them, look, I'll go and investigate, I'll talk to Fred or Mary, and what I'll do is I'll give you a call back and I'll let you know once I've spoken to them. So that would be a perfectly appropriate way of dealing with a potential conflict in those circumstances, provided, of course, that you do get back to them, and that's the important part. This is not avoiding as in I'm never going to deal with it. It's just buying yourself time and space so that you can get the right information that you need to make that decision. In terms of collaboration, as I said before, if you've got the time, it's a great way of dealing with conflict because it means that both parties have to come to a mutually acceptable agreement which doesn't compromise either party's interests. So when would you use that? Well, if the issue is important and the people that you're involved in the negotiation are important, then it might well be important to collaborate. So to work with the other party. So a good question that you might ask the other person or persons in a conflict is, are you willing to work with me to see if we can come up with another way of resolving this? Great question, because what it does is testing out whether the other person's willing to collaborate with you. And of course, if they say yes, then you can start brainstorming ways and means around the conflict. And of course, if they say no, then you realise that it's futile for you to try and come up with a resolution that you'll both be happy with because it's not going to work, and you might then revert to compromise. Now, where there's a motivation to resolve the issue, where both parties are equally motivated to resolve the issue, that's where collaboration can be very effective, assuming, of course, you've got the time. So if both parties are keen to resolve it, then it's certainly appropriate for you to work together, because both of you are willing to work together because the outcome is important to both parties. So where there needs to be a commitment to a solution from both parties, that's where collaboration might be very effective. So this is why people who have a high score in collaboration can often find things frustrating, because they find that the other person has a less interest in resolving it than themselves, and so therefore they're less motivated to enter into some sort of a dialogue about another way forward. So you've got to make sure that both parties are interested, otherwise it's not going to work. And sometimes you'll come up with a better result by sitting down and brainstorming with someone about some possible solutions. And that's why this can be a very effective approach as well, because if you enter into a dialogue, and a dialogue based on goodwill, then you'll often come up with a better way of dealing with something by conversation, by sheer discussion. You can come up with a better answer. So that's collaboration. And the last one on the grid that we'll talk about now is compromise. Now, compromise is where you give a bit and the other person gives a bit. So it's kind of like a win-win, but a watered-down version of collaboration. So if time's running out, you have to make a decision. You've been compromising, perhaps you've been collaborating, perhaps, and you've got to make a decision by the close of business today. You might then make some concessions and ask for some concessions in return to come up with a solution. Sometimes it can be used, as I said, when collaboration doesn't work or when you try and compete and that's not working either. So you start to make some concessions and ask for some concessions in return. It can be a temporary short-term solution to conflict, so you can actually use this as a one-step approach and then agree with the other party that when you have more time and space, that you'll both sit down and come up with a resolution that you're both happy with in its entirety, but in the short term, let's compromise. So that would be perfectly appropriate in those circumstances. Sometimes it's the only way, and as I said earlier, many of the cultures that we work in, I've got people from all over the world in this presentation. The truth of the matter is that sometimes the cultural constraints would suggest that compromise is the only way. And so overlaid on all of this is a cultural imperative to compromise. So it might be appropriate in those circumstances. Now, what you're seeing on your screen now, and I'm not going to run through all this in great detail, you'll get a copy of this, as I said later on, but each of these negotiation and conflict behaviours have pros and cons attached to them. So there are advantages and disadvantages for each. And that's why one simple approach is not appropriate to all circumstances. And that's why it's important for you to be able to flex around the grid and to be able to move from one different strategy to another, depending on the other person, depending on the circumstances, depending on your needs. So you need to be prepared to be flexible. So let me give you an example of that. Let's say that two people are having an altercation in your work area, and it's a mild altercation, and you think to yourself, I won't get involved because they're mature adults and they should be able to sort their problems out. So you decide to avoid, or as it says on the screen there, evade. So you don't get involved, thinking that they will sort it out. But as you get back to your work, you notice that it's getting more and more hostile. So really you've got no choice but to get involved because you happen to be their executive leader. So you pull both parties aside, and in private you ask them to try to come up with some sort of a compromise. So you go to the middle area there, and both parties are not willing to compromise. They're digging their heels in and they don't want to compromise. So you then might try and collaborate, and you might say to both parties, well, we need to work together to sort this out because frankly you two have got to work together and we can't have this continue. So you try to collaborate with both parties, and both parties are not interested in collaborating. All right. So then as the senior manager, you may then compete, and then you might impose a solution on both parties on the basis that you've tried several different strategies to resolve this, and in the end you need it to be resolved, and you've decided that you will make a decision about how this will be resolved. So effectively what I've done is I've used 4 of the 5 approaches to be able to deal with the one situation. Doesn't mean it will work, but what it means is it opens up an array of possibilities for you to be able to resolve a situation rather than to bang on with one particular approach. Okay, so here's some scenarios. We've got about 10 minutes left before we finish up, and I want to just share with you a couple of scenarios, and I want you to have a think about how you might resolve these scenarios. And they're fairly broad. I haven't given you a lot of information about each, but it's enough to perhaps make a judgment call about which of the 5 conflict resolution styles I would use in the circumstances that I'm given. So the first one here is you've got a customer that calls and they want you to handle an order for them, right? So they know you, they've got a relationship with you, and you no longer work in that team. So you've had an internal restructuring, and it would create a major problem internally if you cross departments. However, the customer who orders a moderate amount of product has been very insistent with you. So what do you do? All right, there's a number of things that you could do, but probably the best way to look at that is to start looking at some of the things you wouldn't do. So let's have a look. You can't avoid it because the reality is the customer's there and you've got to deal with it. So you can't really avoid it. So that's out of the question. If you accommodate, which might seem like a reasonable proposition at the time, in other words, you take the order for the customer on the basis that they order a moderate amount of product, you're going to have some problems internally. Not only are you going to have some problems internally, you're probably going to train that customer to come back to you next time and the time after. So you're training them to continue to communicate with you, even though it's not necessarily a good thing to do. So that's not really a good solution. Now, it's probably not a good idea to compete either, I might say. So it's no good necessarily saying to the customer, well, look, I'm not going to serve you. You need to go and talk to someone else. The rules have changed internally. I no longer deal with that. You need to go and talk to Fred or Mary. Now, whilst that may well be true, you're probably going to annoy the customer, who, remember, is probably a good customer, so that's probably not a good way to go. So your only options are to compromise or collaborate. So I might say to the customer, for example, look, what I'll do, I want to introduce you to Fred or Mary. Now, Fred and Mary specialise in this area. They're working in a different department, and I will help you build a relationship up with them because I acknowledge that you've been a good customer, and I think the least I can do is introduce you. And then when you have additional orders, you can go straight to them because I can help you pave the way. That would be a reasonable collaboration. So it's probably collaboration I'd suggest in that case there, I would have thought would be the right way. What do you think? Okay, situation 2. Now this is a personal situation, but it's one I'm sure many of us have been involved in, and that is this. You've had your car in for repair, and although they claim it's fixed, you've got the same problem. So there might be a noise under the bonnet or something. It's not a regular fault and it's obvious. You paid your bill, and when you collect the car and you're not prepared to pay any more, so you paid a hefty fee, but the problem hasn't been fixed. They are the only dealer that is at all convenient to you, so that's a bit of a red herring. So it's inconvenient if you go and take your business somewhere else. And of course, you want your car fixed properly now because ultimately you need to continue using your car. So let's talk about what you wouldn't do and then work our way back to perhaps the right answer. Well, you can't avoid it because they've got your car, so that's not going to work. I don't think it's appropriate to accommodate because you're actually in the right. You paid your money. It's obvious that the fault is still there. So it's not probably a good idea for you to pay extra. It's not a good way to go because they'll just take advantage of that behaviour. You could certainly, it's possible to compromise, I guess, and you could probably collaborate. But I think at the end of the day, you're in the right here, and I think you have every right to respectfully compete and ask that this be fixed, and how quickly will it be until they fix it, and that you're not prepared to pay any more. That would be appropriate, I think, in that circumstance. All right, as unpleasant as it might be, nevertheless, if you don't compete there, you'll put yourself in a very difficult position later on. And what often people do is they try a number of these, and then they end up competing, and then the person in the business think you're being very unreasonable. So you're better off being very clear and straight up front with that sort of situation. All right, situation 3. You're a manager. Okay, you're a manager of a team that's currently using a manual recording system. And your analysis shows greater productivity if it's automated. So you've got information about that. However, Susan Jones, who runs a similar kind of operation in another team, she disagrees with your proposition, citing customer concerns and employee resistance, plus technical problems with the system you're proposing. So she's not sold on your idea. So she's sold on her idea, you're sold on your idea, But the manager, your manager, has told you that you've got to resolve the situation with Susan because you both must run the same way. So you must both have the same system, although you've got strong views. So let's look at what you wouldn't do. You can't avoid it because the manager's asked you to solve it. Competing will only work to a certain extent because obviously you both have strong views about that. You can't, I don't suggest it's a good idea to accommodate. The reason being, of course, is that your system may actually be a better system than Susan Jones. And so in the interest of the organisation, it's not probably a good idea just to cave into her request. So what does that leave you with? Well, you can't really compromise because, frankly, you've both got to use the same system, either your system or Susan's system. So I might suggest to Susan, let's try it your way for a week. And once we've trialed it for a week, how about we try it my way for the following week? And let's get our teams together and compare notes and see which system actually works best. Okay, now Susan's motivated to resolve it because your manager's her manager, and it may work that way, assuming you've got the opportunity to do that. Now, situation 4, and this is an interesting one because, again, it's a personal issue rather than a factual type situation. Your boss has a personal dislike to one of your team and insists on you not renewing that person's contract or firing them. So they've said, you've got to get rid of so-and-so. Whilst you have some occasional problems, you can manage that quite easily. And in fact, that person's quite important to the output of your team. So, what do you do in those circumstances? Because now we've got a power relationship involved. Well, you could actually avoid. In other words, you could just not do anything, firstly, and just test the water and see whether that manager was really serious about that, or whether in fact they were just having a bad day with so and so nothing else happened. So you could try that. It's not a good idea to accommodate. By accommodating, what you do is you go and sack so and so on the advice of your boss. The rest of your team will be very, very unhappy with you and think, well, when my back is turned, what does my boss say about me? If that's how he supports so-and-so, what would he do when I'm not around? So that's probably not a good idea. You could respectfully compete with the boss, I think, depending on your relationship with him or her. And you could say, well, look, that person's actually a very effective member of the team. And whilst I do recognise that sometimes they can be a pain in the backside, the reality is they're very important to the team output, and your issue is a personal issue rather than a work-related issue. So you could do that. And of course, it would depend on your relationship with your boss as to whether or not, in fact, that was effective, and how much, of course, that boss disliked so-and-so. You could compromise, out of sight, out of mind, move them to another shift or whatever. But so there's a number of ways of dealing with situation 4, I think. Now, situation 5. As a manager, you want to design a new system in a way that suits you. Your approach at the managers' meeting is to raise it with the other managers who are all affected by the proposed new system. One of the other managers says it's too costly that way, and that each manager should simply offer their approach and the general manager make their decision. So in other words, that person is probably wanting to avoid the decision making, and you're a member of that team and you've heard them say that in the meeting. What would you do? Well, you could accommodate by saying to that person, okay, that's probably not a bad idea. Probably not a good idea, because I'm sure the general manager would actually prefer that you all resolved it rather than him or her get involved. So that's probably not a good approach. And besides, your system, you have some vested interests on your system, so that's not a good idea. You could suggest to the person, why don't we continue to talk about it? In other words, why don't we continue to collaborate? And if after a period of time we can't come to a resolution, how about we compromise? So I'm actually using two approaches there, aren't I? I'm collaborating or suggesting that we do collaborate. And then I'm also suggesting that if that doesn't work, that there's a plan B, which is to perhaps compromise or even go back to the accommodation and allow the general manager to make the decision. So I have a number of strings to my bow there that might assist me in those sorts of circumstances. So you can see it's very interesting, isn't it, that we can give you a number of scenarios, and there are some possibilities around that about how to resolve it. So, I guess my point about all of this is if plan A doesn't work, it's not the end of the earth. You need to swap and change and try plan B or indeed even C or D if necessary, because one of those may well work. So my key message out of today's webinar, folks, is a simple one. You need to be flexible. You need to not overuse your preferred style, which comes out of the conflict diagnostic. You need to make sure that you are not deluding yourself into thinking that this is actually the correct way when in fact you could be trying another way. And of course, the third principle out of today is if plan A doesn't work, then you know what? Try plan B and continue around the grid until you might hit the mark. So that's simply how to deal with conflict. Does it mean you're going to be 100% effective? No. But does it mean you'll be more effective than you are? Yes. And that's really what it's about. Our job is to become more effective at negotiation and more effective at dealing with conflict. And that's essentially my message to you. So it won't surprise you that your homework is that I want you to go out and I want you to start practicing using all 5 styles. And if necessary, then I'd print off the slide where the model's on when you'll get later on and post it up on your whiteboard or wherever you might put it in your office environment. And every time you are in a conflict or negotiation, refer to the model to remind you that there are actually 5 ways of skinning a cat, not just one way. And so that might force you into rethinking your approach and how you might deal with it. So that's your homework. I want you to have some fun with it. You know what the good news is? The good news is this afternoon you will, assuming it's lunchtime where you are, this afternoon you will have conflict. That's the good news. Why is it good? Because it means that you will be able to practice some of these styles this afternoon and start to get good at using all 5 approaches. So folks, that's pretty much it. Thank you. I've enjoyed working with you again. What we'll do is in a couple of weeks' time, of course, we'll look at culture, but I want you to practice your negotiation and conflict resolution skills, and I want you to do it as effectively as you possibly can. And by doing that as effectively as you can, I'm hoping that you'll be more effective at dealing with conflict. So thank you, guys. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll catch up in 2 weeks' time. Thank you, and goodbye.